All right.
All right. Finally, the great Ankur Pandit.
What's going on?
Not much, man. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. I've always really enjoyed all of our conversations that we had when we worked together.
Yeah.
I think very highly of you. I think you're, an ambitious, smart, young dude, and you're doing great things, and you will do great things. And I'm a great admirer and supporter of you. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into some stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to. So yeah, thank you for the intro. Appreciate the kind words. My name is Ankur. I am a 24-year-old man who wears a lot of hats, digital marketing professional, a writer, a thinker, active citizen, Canadian. Najib and I know each other because we work together at Aleph and Statecraft and Brain Trust and the like. And so I had spent a good 9-10 months with Najib, and I'm happy to call him not only a mentor, but a good friend. And Najib and Vieri are kind of like the wise uncles in my life. It's good to have them in my life and just be able to speak with them. And so, I asked to catch up, and Najib was like, why don't we do it over a podcast? And so I'm happy to be here to catch up. And then in terms of, what's new with me, I'm working on a podcast of my own. So that's exciting. Myself and two friends of mine, Tom and Tony, we always have really good conversations, kind of like with yourself, how I have with yourself. And so we decided, why don't we just record these? And we started thinking about what we wanted the podcast to be about, what we wanted to call it. And when we were chatting, we realized that all of us are born in 96, which technically makes us the last millennials, but also makes us the beginning of Gen Z. And we realized that we're kind of on this cusp of a generation, and that there's certain things that we're noticing as a generation. We want to be able to speak to that. So the name of our podcast is actually called The Cusp. And we just try to talk about things that our generation sees. And so the first episode that we got coming out is coming out pretty soon. We've talked about things about, I think the working title was something like too old for TikTok, too young for income security. And so we've talked a lot about how social media has changed from when we were kids till now, as well as a lot about what's happening to millennials now with with back-to-back recessions over the last 2 decades, right? And so the podcast
let's get into that. I mean, that's why, one of the many reasons I wanted to have you on and talk to you, Ankur, was because, I want to have that perspective of, what's happening with millennials, Gen Z. And like you said, I mean, you guys are getting hit with like the second big recession. I mean, during the financial collapse, 2008, 2009, millennials were 20 to 30% unemployed, depending where they lived. That's a huge loss of income that you may never recover from in terms of your prime working years, or at that time most of you might have just graduated and were just trying to hit your stride. What are the long-term effects now of like what could actually be the equivalent of the Great Depression that we're going through now with this pandemic? What do you think are some of the long-term effects, or even just the immediate effects?
Right. I think it's interesting. I think we have to take a look at this in a couple ways. The first is just to delineate. I think the people that have had it the worst off are what I would say is older millennials, people right now who would be in their mid-30s, because in 2008, 2009, these people were graduating from college, right? And so they come out of college, a ton of student debt, especially if you're in the States, a ton of student debt, ready to get into positions. They either can't find a position or they're underemployed. So they're maybe bartending, they're hosting, they're doing things that don't necessarily require a university degree. And maybe over the next decade, they finally got their stuff together. Maybe they have children, and now they're hit with this. So not only have they not been able to save or have that steady source of income that people like GenX had their predecessors, but now a lot of them, especially the older millennials, are dealing with things like with their old financial obligations. So I'm talking rent, student loans, but as well with new financial obligations. So I'm talking kids, right? And helping kids. So I think they probably, out of anyone, if I could talk about a subsect of people that have had it the worst, it would probably be them. If I could speak to my own generation, and by that I mean like I'm in my mid-20s, so I would say like very late millennials, very young millennials, or older Gen Zs. I think for us, we are just starting to get into the workforce. the last recession was more cautionary. Like we were probably 12, 13, 14 years old. So we saw the fear in our parents where they were afraid to get laid off. And we saw the general economic anxiety. And with this pandemic as well, I think what it's going to mean is we're going to be a more, my prediction is we're going to be a little bit more of a cautious generation. We're going to try to save more in our coffers, because we've seen this happen not once, but twice. And we've seen what it's done to our older brothers and sisters and our parents in 2009. And now we're living it firsthand. We're new grads or we're right about to graduate, and there's so much uncertainty, right? So I think it's going to cause us to be a little bit more cautious than prior.
Well, what do you guys, given that, and I mean, you're right. I mean, you are a young millennial and a Zoomer, as they call them.
Yeah.
So, and you're absolutely right. Ankur, is that, we had maybe 3-4 of these kinds of pandemics in all of the 20th century. And now we've had 3 or 4 in just the first 20 years of this century, right?
Yeah.
So they're happening more often. They're happening closer together. So you're absolutely right. We have to kind of plan for when is the next one, not if, right?
Yeah.
So, combined with climate change concerns, we got, cyber warfare, we've got, financial collapses, we've got pandemics, like, combined with all that stuff, I mean, we're definitely looking at something like this happening every decade or so. What do millennials, what do Zoomers do in order to future-proof their own futures?
Good question. I think 2 things exist simultaneously in our generation. The first is existential dread. Like there is a sense of like climate change is happening in the United States, especially gun violence. There's this pandemic right now. There is a sense that, like, and not even just a sense, the data proves that a lot of things that our parents had, whether it's housing or education, are way more expensive for us. So there is a sense of existential dread. But on the positive side, I think there is also a sense of like, you know what? We can't let shit stand the way that it is because we're so young. So there's a sense of like, we can fight to change this. So, and I would point to things like the climate march or the March for Justice. If you look at a lot of these kids who are in high school right now, one thing that I've been impressed by is just the level of social justice and how much they care about this. In a conversation with 2 of my friends earlier, they're talking about how they talk to teachers these days. And they're like, teachers, what is something new that you notice in this up and coming generation? So these are people a little bit younger than me, but still, I guess I can speak to that. And the teachers were like, empathy. They're just empathetic and compassionate, and they get it. And they get that there are certain things that we're going to have to come together to solve. So I think that's what I would say, like a sense of collective dread and anxiety, yes, but also a sense of like solidarity, saying like we can solve these things together. And I would point to people like Greta Thunberg and other youth activists as proof of that.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think you guys have great examples of people leading the charge. But let's dip into reality a bit, right? Like, the fact of the matter is, you are the first generation to have a less of a chance of being more financially successful than the generation before. You actually also have lower health indicators and life expectancy as well, right? Those are all factors of the things that we've talked about, including the anxiety, the depression, the mental illness that has already come, from, like you said, watching your parents go through the financial collapse, and now yourself going through a pandemic. Like those things are only going to multiply and exponentially be of concern for your generation. And even like, and you didn't talk about this, is assets, right? You guys, you're having a very difficult time accumulating assets. And let's face it, rent is just a transfer of wealth, my friend, right?
Yeah, true.
Transfer of wealth from the have-nots to the haves, right? And the boomers and my generation X, have accumulated all the assets, including properties and land, and you guys are paying our mortgages or paying for our lifestyles if we have property that's already paid off.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's totally true. And there's a sense of like, I'm doing so much, am I ever gonna make it? Like, and a great example of that is like, if you talk to people, I wouldn't say my age because I'm just out of college, but let's say a couple years older, approaching their 30s right now, or looking at their first home, or looking at getting married, like that stuff is, especially in markets like Toronto and Vancouver, extremely expensive. It isn't like, I remember listening to a podcast, and this is a funny little anecdote, and the podcast guy was like, one of the reasons that marriage has changed, for example, was back in the day, it was like, you were 25, you might be married, you might have a house, you might have 2 kids, it is what it is. Now, if you're 30 and you don't have any debt, you did a really good freaking job, right? Like, it's just changed. And so it is absolutely tougher in that regard. And I'm not necessarily sure if I have the answers. It's more just
Let
like,
me
I do.
let me posit this. So, and I'm going to ask this in form of questions because I don't have the answers either.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you some old fogey questions. So is your generation too reliant on tech and the gig economy? Is the idea of self-employment, being founders, being tech billionaires, and all this imagery that's been pushed on you because you are digital natives, are you too reliant on that? Do you think that after this pandemic that maybe some of your generation will look for more stability, right? Look at, work jobs that actually have career paths, or government jobs, or, other established industries and employment, just to have that some sort of stability moving forward and have that guaranteed paycheck versus just chasing, the entrepreneurial dream that is you're constantly bombarded with.
It's a good question. I think I have a couple thoughts on this. The first one is, I think the gig economy is going to have to change. And the reason why is the gig economy has basically legitimized what we said physical companies and physical retail couldn't do. And I'll explain this a little bit. So like a couple of years back, in places like McDonald's, they were talking about having a system where that people were only getting paid based on the hours where they were actually interacting with customers. And so it was like, let's say you worked an hour, you'd only get paid like 37 minutes if those are the times where you're actually doing transactions, right? Mm-hmm. And what a company like Uber or Airbnb essentially has done, or Uber actually, what a company like Uber has done is basically legitimize that model and said it's okay because of the flexibility it provides you, right? Because you're only really getting paid for the ride that you're doing, but because you're not because of the flexibility, because you don't have to show up for certain hours, because people are doing it, it's totally fine, right? And so I think what we're already starting to see, especially in places like California, is governments coming in and be like, that's kind of bullshit. Like, you guys these aren't contractors, these are employees, right? And so that delineation has to be a little bit more clear, I think, because right now, essentially what's happening is some of these Uber workers who are working full-time are getting paid less than minimum wage, right? And that shouldn't happen. That is a way in which a private entity has subverted the intentions of the government here, right? So I think in that light, those kinds of companies are going to change. And even if it's not in the short term, it's going to happen at some point, because I don't think they're going to be able to pay less than minimum wage for that long without some sort of intervention. I think in terms of your other question, it's kind of funny. So I grew up, the whole time I was in school, I always assumed that entrepreneurship was on the rise, right? At least because in culture, it was just more sexy. But when I started doing some digging into data, I was reading Andrew Yang's book. I think I remember I told you about it, The War on Stupid People or whatever. He was saying that actually new business creation has gone down, right? Contrary to popular belief, new business creation has gone down. And if you think about it, in a lot of ways, it makes sense. If one of the reasons why, one of the ways that in which people will start new businesses if they have a sort of cushion. If they're not worried about paying medical bills, paying back student loans, extremely high cost of living, they're more likely to start a new business because they have that cushion in case something goes wrong. A lot of that doesn't exist right now. And so even though I think the term entrepreneurship and startup life has become more sexy, small business creation has actually gone down, right? And so those are two things I would say. In terms of your third part, whether or not we're going to find like stability, I think so. Like my gut tells me that we're probably going to lean towards a more stable income, at least for our main job, with like stuff like Uber or what's the word? Uber Eats being like side gigs. Like I have friends right now who are doing it as side gigs right now because of COVID. Like I have good friends in my circle that are like, yo, like I have a gig. I don't know if it's going to last. So I'm doing this on the side. Right. So side hustles, I think, are going to keep going. I don't know if we're going to see as many millennials and Gen Zs take the risk on making startups their main hustle just because of the level of uncertainty right now. But
how much do you think,
to see.
how much do you think that has to do with like some of the shine has now rubbed off of these, you know, tech unicorns, these big tech companies like, you know, Amazon, Facebook, Uber,
Yeah.
you know, now Uber, Amazon are like the face of, you know, what everybody doesn't want companies to be, right? These giant capitalist, you know, resource sucking, non-tax paying corporations, right? So I wonder if how much that has to do with where like now the aspiration piece isn't there as much as before, as, you know, young people are starting to see like these t-shirt billies, these, you know, t-shirt billionaires who run these corporations are no different than the three-piece suit wearing bankers who came before them, right? You know, let's segue that into the talk about fake wokeness, right? These companies fake, you know, now I'm like so amazed, like bank CEOs are talking about UBI, right? Bank CEOs are talking about why they have to behave responsibly, right? And it just makes me chuckle because it's all talk, like they haven't done anything. You see any waiving of mortgage payments, waiving of credit card payments, you know, suspension of any types of loans or debt from banks? It's all just conversation, right? Which you know, I'm sure we've seen that many times from many different companies. How much of it has to do with that, of just the reality that, you know, the cultures that we have that reward business success and financial success create the types of individuals and types of companies that all fall into this category of predatory capitalism?
It's a really good question. I think frankly we may see a paradigm shift come out of all this, and I think it's been a long way coming. So if you take a look at some of these big tech companies, right, in the early 2000s all the way even up to the early 2010s, they were just glorified. One of the reasons why was they were so innovative. The second reason why was because they were providing access to information at a scale we've never seen before. And they the missions of companies like Google and Facebook were also really well aligned with the missions of the United States administration and the internet at large, which is connect the world, right? So in a lot of ways, people saw them in a very utopian light. They also attracted a ton of young people. It was sexy, right? Now, as we start to see, we're almost starting to unsheath the beast and see like all the negative externalities. I think Cambridge Analytica was a turning point in that regard. Like once I know that once Cambridge Analytica came out for me, I started being like, hold on a second, what is going on with these algorithms here? What kind of data do they have on me? And I remember from there, I started reading more about platforms like Amazon, platforms like Apple, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one of the early indicators that our generation will see a paradigm shift exists in the polling of the youngest people right now. If you talk to the youngest people, especially in the United States, I don't know the polling data in Canada, but I know the polling data in the United States. The majority of young people in the United States identify as socialists, right? That is like contrary to what the mainstream media has been putting up for the last 30 years, where socialism has been tied to communism, where it's anything that's even remotely socialist is kind of shunned. Most young people lean that way. And I think that's a result of two recessions now, and a result of just them not finding the opportunity, them seeing kind of like, hey, this system isn't working for us. So I
don't know, man, though, but let me push back on that a little bit here, okay? So if that is true, and you know what, 2 U.S. elections now, I've bought into this narrative that, you know, young people, millennials and Gen Z will embrace socialism like my generation and the generation before it won't, because we we connect socialism and identify socialism with the Soviet Union and the Cold War,
right.
you know, and those kinds of imageries and memories, versus you guys don't. You don't have recollection of that. You see socialism, and you're like, it basically means that we all help each other and we provide safety nets and social security for each other. What's wrong with that, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
But Ankur, my pushback is you've had now 2 chances to elect Bernie Sanders, probably like the picture boy of socialism, and you failed. You failed in both times. Now, the first time I can give young people a pass because there's a lot of other factors that were at play, but this time, I mean, looks what the data shows is you guys didn't show up. You didn't show up for him.
Yeah. And I'm still perplexed by that as well. And the reason why I'm perplexed by that is the fact that we see that this is a very, what's the word? It seems to be a very politically engaged generation, and yet that doesn't lead to voting. And I'm wondering if there is a sense of just like, it doesn't matter what we do. Do you know what I mean? At least politically, like at least in terms of electing people, which I don't think is the case for me and a lot of the friends that I talk to, but I'm wondering if that's the case. So in terms of that disconnect, I don't really know if I can explain it because frankly, I'm confused by it too. The one thing I would say though is Bernie Sanders' ideas, even if Bernie Sanders hasn't been elected, his ideas are very much present in the discourse in a way that they weren't 4 years ago, 8 years ago, right?
Yeah, but so, you and I both know, Ankur, that nobody, considering, you know, who looks like it's going to be the nominee, the Democratic nominee, is not going to be able to carry that flag. He's not going to be able to carry Bernie's ideas, right? Because he's an establishment candidate. Right now, it's all well and good, and you know, you'd be a fool to not embrace some sort of socialist programs and socialist policy during the pandemic. I don't know how long that'll last, you know, considering the history of these of the Democratic Party and their candidate. But let's leave that aside. I mean, because you've touched on a couple of things I think we need to touch on. Obviously, I think, you know, other than the further dissection of voting also goes into race as well, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, and I've said this many times, that one of the issues for young people, one of the barriers is how we still force people to vote, right? We force them to take time off work and go to a polling booth and stand in line and vote, right? And you know, we don't allow for online or mail-in ballot, and it looks like they're not going to allow that again this year, even though, you know, isolation factors. They're still trying to suppress the ability to mail in. So so I think that's a factor, and that's a legitimate factor. I believe that online voting would, you know, greatly increase the participation rate of young people, because you guys, you know, you digital natives come from an era where if I do my research and I like something, I want to buy it right now, and I can online, right? So why can't I do the same for my politics? I do my research, you know, if I'm not totally politically engaged, the day of or day before. Or why does there even have to be an election day, man? Like if there's online voting, you could just vote whenever the window is open.
Like window,
right? Right? Like why can't I just like do my research? You know, if I only want to spend a couple of hours on this, like who I want to vote for, why can't I just do my research and then put in my vote and then put it out of my mind?
Right.
Why can't I enter into a group chat? Why can't I enter into a group chat with my buddies from school and we bounce it around, we chop it up, we make a decision and we vote, right? Why do I have to wait and show up at a place again? And why isn't, you know, all these voter suppression methods? Like why isn't voting on a weekday, right? Or sorry, on a weekend? Why isn't it, you know, mandatory to vote, right? All of these things that limit and inhibit voter participation, I think, are all barriers for young people.
Yeah, and they're especially barriers for minorities and young people, like you said. And I think, frankly, one of the arguments against online voting right now is the fact that there isn't sufficient cybersecurity to ensure election integrity. But frankly, I think if that was a priority for the government and they wanted to see young people out and voting, they would spend the money to ensure that. Like they're not spending the money. So
also, I mean, Ankur, you guys have to call bullshit on that every time someone says it, okay?
But
if you're a cyber criminal, are you gonna mess around with online voting? Or are you gonna mess around with transfers of wealth? You know what I mean? Anybody who has the money and the means can transfer millions of dollars online, but I can't vote online. The other thing is this pandemic shows more than ever what bullshit that is, because We are all applying for benefits online. The government is giving us benefits, allowing us, all of our private information.
You're right.
Our private information is entered onto these government websites, Ankur, in order for us to qualify for these benefits. So don't tell me that a government website can't allow me in secrecy and security to vote.
Right.
Pure and utter bullshit and nonsense.
Yeah,
and you guys have to push back on that, because
that's actually true. Yeah, and I think
you guys have to push back on this.
The other thing we have to push back on, though, is like, you're correct in that regard. Like, if we can send thousands of dollars over the internet, we can vote over the internet, frankly. So that's true. I haven't really thought about that. That's true. The other thing we also have to think about now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this: how does political participation and political dissent go online? So right now in COVID, right? Like, let's say, I don't think this is as prominent, but let's say in Canada, but especially in countries where there's a lot of animosity towards the ruling parties. Let's say you want to have a protest, but there's a lockdown and we cannot hang out and we cannot congregate. How does that level of political dissent and like protest translate online, right? Like, what does that digital public square become?
Also, I mean, it's not just that, Ankur. It's also like, what's the value today of protest? You know what I mean? Like, protest and rallies, I would argue, accomplish just as much for the people that you're protesting against as they do for you, right? Because what happens is, in protests and rallies, that the governing party or whatever body you're trying to protest against, they use that to divide people further, right? I'll give you an example. Unions protesting. You know what I mean? There was a time when unions protesting caused serious social concern because, you know, if they're walking off jobs, if they're not at their jobs, you know, it was really difficult for companies and for people to get around, etc., right? Nowadays, I don't think that's what happens, right? There's so many workarounds in terms of being able to keep things going. So, but only what happens is, you know, is that the person that you're the antagonist in this scenario just uses that as a way of being like, listen, hey man, Ankur, you don't have a job, but these union guys have time to go sip coffee and sit on the legislative steps and with signs and hang out all day, you know, while you've been unemployed for 3 months, you know, they're complaining about, you know, a wage rollback of 2% or 5% or whatever it is, right? So it's very easy for me to turn that around, right? Because the problem with, you know, protest rallies is without other means and mechanisms as well, they're very ineffective, right? If you're not participating on all three prongs of protest, right? Social, which is protest rallies, etc., is one, right? The other is obviously financial. You have to in some way financially harm your antagonist, right? And the third is judicial, right? You have to take it to the courts. You have to get laws changed, right? Or you have to resist laws being changed, right? So very few movements do all three of those things, because guess what? The easiest of those things, I would argue, is gathering and protest and rallies. I think that's the easiest to do. And it actually shows that you're doing something and you might get some media coverage, right? Judicial is very expensive, so that's one problem there, right? Especially if you're taking on government, they have more lawyers and deeper pockets than, you know, almost anyone. So, you know, they'll just wear you out and bleed you out, right? So, and then the third piece is the financial, and that to me is like the most powerful, that is never enacted, right? And the, you know, the perfect example I always give is, you know, when bus drivers were protesting in Japan, they didn't stop driving the bus, they stopped collecting fares, right? Because they know that they want to keep the public on their side. So beautiful, my bus still shows up, my driver's still there, he's still as, you know, pleasant as always, but he asks me not to pay because he's protesting, and he's hurting the people he needs to hurt, not me, right? Those kinds of things aren't thought through, right? Those kinds of things aren't organized. Those kinds, you know, even like now, like to me, it's just like, you know, we have winter, right? Or, you know, now going into summer months, like, you know, if I was going to protest, I would not have my group show up at the ledge stairs. I would have them show up where, you know, we would get the most public return on investment, which is like, you know, maybe show up at seniors' homes and, you know, deliver care packages during the pandemic, mow lawns, you know, shovel snow. Like, you know, you can still have your signs up. And now with all the foot traffic going on, you know, people will actually see and maybe, you know, understand what it is you're protesting against. right?
Yeah.
These kinds of things are not thrown through. Like, to me, like you're actually playing into the hands of the antagonist in this scenario. I'll just keep calling them antagonists, but you're actually playing into their hands by showing up at their doorstep and protesting them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the point that you made about utilizing like actions that are beneficial to the public, like mowing someone's lawn or like making deliveries of food to the elderly or people who are isolating right now, is like a great way to like raise awareness, because people are like, oh yeah, these people are doing this awesome thing for the community. That's great. Can you tell me a little bit more about the initiative? And in that light, you can be like, yes, we're doing this. We're also would like to raise awareness about this issue. Right. And that way the public's already on your side, where they're like, oh yeah, you know what? I never really thought about this. And I like that they're doing this thing that's nice for the community.
Yeah, we don't want to do the heavy lifting anymore, right? We want to sit and click away at our keyboards and think that that's how we're going to change things, right? But as you've seen, it hasn't changed anything, hasn't changed much, right? And also, I mean, obviously digital campaigns are part of the movement as well. But, to me, the digital campaign is always to amplify. It shouldn't be the movement itself. More and more, when I see these initiatives, online digital campaigns, there is no real life campaign tied to it, right? Versus it should be the opposite. The example I always give is, because I live downtown, I used to see the yellow vest guys, out every morning protesting, on the corners downtown, right? And I was just like, you know what? It's like 7, 8 in the morning. These guys are protesting. They all got coffee cups and, they must be eating somewhere. Right. Yeah. So you know what, if I was a real protester and not just an online activist like most people are, I would go and take my group of people and I would go find out where these guys are getting their coffee and breakfast from. And I would go talk to those establishments and be like, do you understand that these people you're serving, this is what they represent? Are you okay with that? Because if you're not okay with that, you shouldn't be serving them. Right. That does two things. A, you build more allies with those people who are just like, oh, I didn't know that. And, yeah, no, actually, I'm not okay with that. And also then you can use social media to amplify those businesses who are knowingly serving those people, right? So, this is the kind of work that we don't want to do anymore, because we want to just sit behind our keyboards and click away and think that we're being effective by protesting online. This obviously doesn't answer your question of how do we congregate and protest and mobilize now that we can't gather in groups.
Yeah, I mean, it does partially. I mean, like one of the things that you mentioned was about in ways that comply with public health advice. If you're able to do something that's beneficial to the public and then make that your protest, that could be a way to do it. But I think largely your point about digital tools are better served to amplify the main voices of your protest as opposed to being the protest themselves is powerful. I think of one thing that I know that I've been guilty of is just like, if I share a post on Instagram, somehow like I've done my part. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think sharing posts on Facebook or Instagram or trying to educate people is good, but I don't think it can ever take place of me voting or me mobilizing an event to raise awareness, or me, you know what I mean? Like there's other things that I should be doing on side of that.
Yeah, no, social, I was talking to an organizer, or a union organizer, and he's like, oh, we don't care what the, Joe Blow public thinks about our protest. And I was like, man, you are living in a dated time, because before, maybe you didn't care like what one or two people might say about your protest, when they go home to their families. Now, that blue-collar guy who hasn't been employed for 2 years and sees you guys protesting a 5% rollback actually posts that up in the groups that he's part of, and he amplifies his message. Like, what a load of crap. I haven't had a job for 2-3 years, and you guys are protesting a 5% rollback, right? And I think that a lot of organizers of these, even I can't remember that environment group that shut down the bridge here in Edmonton, right?
Climate Justice Edmonton, I believe.
Yeah. So, they're patting themselves on the back for all the free coverage they got and yada, yada, yada. Man, every single driver in those cars that you held up from getting to their place of employment and added stress to their work days, not a single one of them has empathy for your movement.
Yep.
Because
100%.
This is the way you chose to get your message across on my back. And and I may have been actually one of your biggest allies. I could be a donor for all you know, right?
I think, Najib, the old proverb, "Do the ends justify the means?" come in right now.
Yeah.
I mean, in that case, the ends didn't, because frankly, the people that they pissed off in the process of raising awareness about their cause are not likely to support their cause anymore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So anyway, I mean, we got kind of segued into the social justice movement, but it was an important conversation. So yeah, so one of my pushbacks was, just this lack of participation that I feel that, young people had displayed, especially in the case of Bernie. So, I'm worried about that. I'm worried, and I've seen it now many times, right? When I was working in overseas in Pakistan, it was the same thing. We used to have these massive rallies where thousands, they made Bernie's rallies look tiny in comparison,
Right.
where thousands and thousands of young people would show up, and for supporting their candidate and their party, but didn't show up to vote. Now, obviously, voter suppression there is on another level as well, so that plays into it as well, right? But you know what? If you're motivated for something, you will do it, right? Also, too, I mean, okay, let's go back to now, and this is what I think an important thing that you and I need to talk about is, celebrity culture. Okay, so
Okay.
I keep hearing this thing, and I've seen it honestly, like in you and other young people that I work with. I've seen it. You have a heightened moral compass. You have a heightened idea of what's ethical and what's not in business and political practices. I've seen it, and I know it's there, right? The issue that I have is you guys also created the influencers of our time, the celebrities of our time.
Right.
You guys are the ones who are, celebrating them, giving them money, amplifying them, following them, liking them, etc. on your social media. You've created the new brand of celebrity, right? The everyday celebrity influencer who also makes millions selling us shit, right? Selling us garbage. So, I want you to talk about that too, because at the end of the day, man, let's not forget, it's celebrity culture that created Trump, okay? And I remind my Gen X friends all the time that we created Trump. We celebrated Trump, man. Like, if anybody tells you that they didn't think Trump was the shit in the 80s and 90s and thought he was the poster boy for success, no matter how many times he was caught cheating or on his wife or cheating on his taxes or bankruptcies, people still admired him, loved. Trump was synonymous with success, okay? So we allowed him to become a celebrity. We allowed him to get that show, and then we watched that show, and he rightfully so, leverage that all into a presidency, right? And I don't see your generation doing anything different, Ankur. Like, I think that, you guys are also headed down that path of this celebrity worship and this celebrity culture.
It's interesting. I'm just trying to think about that for a sec.
Digest that, and I'll keep going. So listen. So here's my issue. So here's my recent examples. Okay, Ryan Reynolds gives $4,000 to the Edmonton Food Bank, and everybody loses their shit. $4,000, Ankur. You and I, in good times, could give $4,000 to the Edmonton Food Bank. Okay, we're celebrating this like he's like the next coming, man. $4,000. You know how minuscule $4,000 to Ryan is like you and me giving $40, man.
So actually, this is a great. Now I have my train of thought.
Okay, go for it.
I think young people do not. I think so. Here's my train of thought. And if you go back to the 1960s, 50s, etc., a lot of young people aspired to the public service, right? They saw the government as a way to create social change. A lot of that was emblematic of the times, right? If you think about what happened post-1930s with FDR, the New Deal, we're talking Social Security, we're talking minimum wage, we're talking the government. It wasn't, should we have the government in the economy? It's what extent should the government be in the economy, right? From there, we then get to this mid-70s. We start seeing Milton Friedman. We start seeing this whole shareholder primacy theory, where people are like, you know what? The only real mandate of these corporations are to create profit for their shareholders, right? And so that reigns dominant for the next 30 or 40 years or so. And then what we start to see is we start seeing the last 10 years or so this what I think is frankly a charade, but the charade of, if I'm a corporation and the things that I do day to day are negative, as long as I engage in corporate social responsibility or some sort of giving or some sort of charitable endeavor, and I market that really well, I think they're like, we'll be fine because people will just eat that up. And frankly, in years prior, we have. In years prior, we have eaten that up. We're like, oh my gosh. Great example. When Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan Zuckerberg donated, I think it was $1 billion. Back in the day, we were like, wow. Education, we're like, wow. Look at these billionaires giving back their money. Look at Oprah. Look at Jay-Z giving back their money. It's great. But I think, like, to be fair, I think over the last couple of years, we've started to see some criticism there. And we've started to be like we've started to take a look at things like like when Jeff Bezos announced he was donating, I think it was $100 million to COVID-19, a whole bunch of videos came out on Instagram, on TikTok, and it was literally like it was like a huge piggy bank with Jeff Bezos' wealth here and $100 million here, and they took like a penny and they dropped it. And I'm starting to see a level of, I would say, skepticism now. So to answer your question, I think for the last 5-10 years, you're right. Young people have also fallen into this fallacy of, we don't need systemic change because these people are making these donations, they're doing these charitable endeavors, that's all good. But I think that at least the young people that are really paying attention to this are starting to be like, okay, this $10 million donation is good, but it doesn't excuse the fact that you guys don't pay taxes. It doesn't excuse the fact that your company is responsible for so many of these problems. So even if you put this in, it's like a drop in the middle of an ocean that you caused. So I think we're starting to smarten up.
Yeah, but Ankur, man, and I'm gonna keep calling bullshit where I hear it, because and it's because, honestly, man, like, if I feel like if young people don't see the path, your generation and Gen Z don't see the path, we're doomed, right? In terms of being able to bring true change. I keep hearing this, like, oh, everything's going to change after the pandemic and everybody's going to be more socially conscious, and, we're all going to be like looking for social value in company. We're going to shop local. Bullshit. No, we're not.
Bullshit.
People don't change that easy. Systems don't change that easy. We're all going to be worried about getting back on track and getting back what we had, and going back to accumulating whatever we want to accumulate and behaving how we ever behaved. I'll show you the best indicator of that. So, Ankur, so again, going back to our conversation about, if you really want change, you got to act on those three things: social, judicial, and economic, financial, right? What have you guys done? You haven't, right? You know how much Jeff Bezos added $24 billion to his wealth during the pandemic, bro?
Right.
So that means you guys aren't doing fuck all, man. You're still buying his shit. You guys are still buying his shit. Okay, let's say it's not just you guys. But here's the thing: like, you guys want to hurt him, then actually stop buying shit on Amazon. You know what I mean?
I disagree with that.
Listen,
I don't think
hear me out. Here's my other piece, and then I'll let you comment, right? Here's my other piece. Why is Bill Gates telling me how I should live my life during a pandemic? This is the same Bill Gates, Ankur, that couldn't identify how much a quart of milk costs, right? He doesn't know. He's so disconnected from the everyday life. He doesn't know how much groceries cost. And now I keep getting messages and videos how Bill Gates was such an oracle and predicted this. Bullshit. Anybody can predict a pandemic when he's based his life, his foundations based on, vaccines and polio eradication, which, by the way, Bill Gates would have you believe that he invented this idea of eradicating polio off the face of the earth, even though people have been doing this work since the late 90s. And actually, by the time that Bill got involved, there's only 3 countries in the world that have polio now, Bill Gates and polio eradication are like synonymous. Bullshit, right? And we can't keep letting this happen. I don't need Bill Gates to explain to me how I should be living my life during the pandemic. I don't need toxic positivity from a billionaire.
Okay. With regards to Bill Gates, I mean, I don't have as many thoughts there, but I do want to focus on the other thing. I think, frankly, it's unfair to expect one of the worst financially well-off, like, generations in history to be the ones to hold this burden of you have to buy local, you have to buy these sorts of companies, because frankly, they're more expensive. And we don't have as much disposable income. So what you're saying to us now is you have to pay for more expensive things. You also have to be woke in these ways. You know what I mean? I think frankly, instead of putting the burden on consumers who are already dealing with like negative economic anxiety, the burden should be on or governments being like, hey, why is it that Amazon has paid barely any federal income taxes? Why is it that we don't have a wealth tax? Why, like, at the end of this, when all this is done, like right now, like frankly, I think it's disingenuous for us to like even like, yes, Jeff Bezos has made billions of dollars during the course of this pandemic, but everyone's attention right now is on the public health disaster of this pandemic. When this is done, though, countries around the world will be trillions of dollars in debt, states and provinces will be billions of dollars in debt, and cities will be millions of dollars in debt. People can't pay that money back because the people are already economically disadvantaged, and we need them to be spending money to incentivize the economy, right? Governments are already broke. They're not going to go even further into debt. We need to get that money some way. And I think, frankly, the conversations about the wealth tax, conversations about cracking down on tax offshoring, and conversations about cracking down on capital gains taxes will increase dramatically. And like, I see young people getting involved there, being like, frankly, we are already so fucked by these two recessions. Why should the economic burden be placed on us? We should be taxing organizations like Amazon, like Apple, who have been able to largely get away with this over the last couple of decades. And we should be taxing people like Jeff Bezos with the wealth tax.
Okay, I'll accept that. I'll accept the fact that, you know, the burden shouldn't be all put on your generation or Gen Z. That's absolutely correct. But then, you know, my question is again, so here's what you're saying. You're saying, you know, we can't afford to buy local. We can't afford, you know, to make some of these changes that require.
In all instances.
Listen, I'm hearing you out. So, you know, Amazon's so cheap, like it's just, you know, we have no option. Come on, man. You just have to buy less. I mean, we've already proven that during this pandemic. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need 5 shirts. Buy one shirt local that's more expensive, that'll last you longer, right? Buy one of something, not 10 of something, right? So consumerism is one of the issues, okay? So, and that's not just on you guys either, right? That's on all of us, right? But again, man, going back to our conversation on Core, man, companies, large corporations, government only listen to 2 things, okay? And you can beat your head against the wall as much as you want, okay? They only listen to money and votes, okay? So no government, no ruling party is going to listen to anyone unless they represent a significant number of votes or it hurts their donor base, okay? Corporations, same thing. Unless it hurts their pocketbooks, you can cry into the void as much as you want about their practices, okay? So we can't at the same time say we need them to change, but I got to keep buying their shit because it's just so damn cheap, right? You can't.
That's fair.
Right?
Yeah.
Second of all, you know, you can, you know, this again, going back to, so my question then is, okay, so you're saying that it's actually governments that have to change and we have to tax these guys and wealth tax and offshoring and stuff. What's going on? And so explain to me or give me an example, and this is unfair to put you on the spot, but maybe you have the answer. Give me an example of one movement that's doing that, man. Like, give me an example of one movement that's actually making steps towards getting this done.
A great question. So a couple things. First, I largely agree with the point that there is an argument about just consuming less. And it's something that I've personally done as well. Like, I've taken a look at my own consumption patterns and been like, you know what? If my shirt from H&M is going to go bad every 6 months, I would rather buy a higher quality shirt. So there absolutely is an argument there, and I think that should be part of the strategy. I just think, frankly, that focusing on that without focusing on systemic policy change is a recipe for disaster. So that's my larger point, but I do agree with you there, right? The second point I want to make is with regards to how this can happen. So nobody really talks about this, but in the middle of this pandemic, France taxed Apple $1.3 billion. And we are starting to see places like France actually put like digital taxes on a lot of these big tech giants, where they're saying the revenues that you derive from operations in our country, we're going to tax that. That wasn't happening before, right? And I think we're going to start to see conversations like taxing the big tech giants. We're going to start seeing conversations like a sales tax on Amazon transactions, right? That goes to like in the United States, for example, they're proposing a sales tax on all digital transactions that goes to the federal government, right? These conversations are happening right now. I
And
think
these are
they're going to get
and they're timely, Ankur. I mean, maybe that's one thing that we can hope and and we should keep pressing on is that somehow the governments are going to have to recoup all this money that they're dishing out to citizens.
Yep.
And the best way to do it is on the backs of these corporations, getting them to ante up. I've been saying that for weeks now, is that these corporations, these large corporations that have been avoiding taxes, that makes billions of dollars in profit, including banks, they need to empty their coffers. There's no reason why Apple or Amazon or any of these companies should be sitting on $1 trillion worth of reserves. No fucking company needs that. Empty your fucking pockets, because you're going to come for bailouts anyway. Empty your pockets. Serve the citizens that you profess to serve, because you're all woke now. Empty your pockets and cough up, and then later on we'll think about bailing you out. Now, if that's not going to happen, then I absolutely think you're right. And a responsible government should be going after them to refill the taxpayers' coffers.
Sorry, Najib, I lost you for a sec. Could you repeat that?
I said the responsible government should be going after these corporations to refill the taxpayers' coffers, to refill our reserves. Hold on a sec. I think I'm having internet problems. I'm going to just pause.
Yeah. Okay.
We lost internet for a bit there, so let's go back a little bit. So you're absolutely right. Maybe that is one of the positive things that come out of this pandemic is that the governments, in seeking to refill their coffers and recoup some of the money that they paid out to citizens, that they will look at these large corporations and tax them heavier and ask them to ante up.
Yeah, and I think so. One thing that gives me hope, Najib, I mean, we've talked a lot about some of the things that are apathy among my generation in terms of voting. We've talked about consumerism versus systemic policy change. One thing that does give me hope is like looking at history. I was reading a lot about the New Deal and the Great Depression, and both how bad it got, which scares me for the next little bit, but also what came out of the Great Depression, right? In the United States, we got Social Security, a minimum wage. We got the SEC to regulate securities. We got massive spending on infrastructure. In Canada, we got the Bank of Canada. We got the CBC. We got employment insurance. A lot of the institutions that mark our economy and our government right now came out of these crises. You know how they say desperate times call for desperate measures? Well, in this case, it could be a good thing. A lot of the things that were pipe dreams only years ago could become reality, and we could see things that we've always wanted to implement be implemented. And
but one of the things, though, Ankur, that we all have to understand is that the person who steered, especially the U.S. through the Great Depression, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? FDR, right?
Yeah.
And he actually called out the bankers and the businessmen for their lack of social responsibility, right? And put those things that you talked about into motion, right? Do we have that leader right now? We don't, right? So this is why it was even more important that people showed up for Bernie, or even up for Bernie, man. Pete Buttigieg should have been the poster boy for your generation. Here's a young guy. He's gay. He's young. He served in the military. He speaks like, I don't know, 80 different languages. Like, good-looking young guy. Like, I thought maybe he would.
But he never resonated with people of color, right? So
absolutely right. Hey, let's talk about that. Hey, let's switch into that. I mean, none of our conversations are complete unless we talk about race relations, both being brown dudes. So let's talk about that, man. Like, so research is coming out. A couple of things that really interested me lately was, this idea that, young or people of color are apathetic in terms of voting and political engagement. And, the study that came out said that actually that couldn't be further from the truth. The reason why we're apathetic is because we're not inspired by the choices we have. A, we're not inspired by the choices we have. And B, we don't think it makes a difference who's in power, which party's in power. They don't serve our interests either way.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
I do. Actually, so this is a personal anecdote. I don't know if I can speak for all immigrant communities here, but I know, at least for South Asian communities, there is a sense of, like, for example, my dad. So when my dad first immigrated to Canada, he was very distrustful of politics, because he was like, I came from a country with corrupt politics. I just saw politics as being akin to corruption. So for me, I just wanted to keep my head out of all that, just focus on staying above water, providing income for you guys. As he spent more time in Canada, he's become more and more politically engaged. And now he's at a point where, like, me and him will have, hour long conversations about politics and candidates and, strategy and stuff like that. So I'm not trying to say this is a defining theory, but one thing that I noticed with my family, and in talking to other immigrant families, I've noticed it too, is the relationship that you have with politics in your home country does dictate, to an extent, the relationship that you have in Canada, right? And so I think that could be one factor where it's like, if you saw corruption being associated with politics at home, you might be turned off from it here. Do I think that's the only factor? Absolutely not. But it was a personal anecdote that I thought was relevant here.
No, we definitely, you're 100% right, Uncle. We definitely carry trauma from our home countries in terms of political engagement in the West when we come here. You're absolutely right. I mean, because we know that it's the corruption that we've seen. And also too, I mean, and you're absolutely right about this. I mean, it takes, a couple generations and before, we aren't so worried about just the basic necessities, food, shelter, and clothing, that we can actually, have the time and the convenience of being politically engaged, right? And I mean, I saw that with my parents, right? My parents were too busy putting a roof over our head, food in our mouths, to worry about who was in power, right? And so we have that luxury, you and I both, because of the work that our parents did. So that's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about you and me, right? So, why aren't we showing up? Why aren't we showing up? I mean, in fairness, we do show up, and it's true. I mean, that's why that study resonated with me, is because, like I say, we did show up. We showed up, for Barack Obama, here locally. We have Naheed Nenshi, who's been, 3-term mayor in one of the most conservative cities in the country.
Cities. Kind of a contradiction, but it's interesting, eh? Yeah.
And not just that. I mean, and he's Muslim, so being elected mayor post 9/11 of a conservative city, is an accomplishment, and so, and then, I think an argument could be made that, people of color actually helped him get to that level as well. So I think when we are inspired, and we do think that somebody that, we aspire to be like, and we really think will actually initiate change for our communities, does step up, we do support that person. But at the end of the day, Uncle, the reality is that those individuals are few and far between. That, in fairness, even there's slim pickings in our own communities for individuals like that, and for us to put them in places where they want to run for office or run for any type of elected office. So that's one of the issues, right? The other issues, I think, Uncle man, we have white savior complex. You want to talk about trauma? I think the white savior complex that our communities have, that we also bring from back home, where you and I both know, the shade of brown that you are also, affects how people perceive you. The darker you are, the lower you're perceived in even our home countries, right? Because then you must be a laborer.
The whole fair and lovely thing, right?
Absolutely, right, man. Like, so, so we have that trauma from colonization as well, and we bring that here as well, and we still have, man. As much as I love the Prime Minister of New Zealand, I think she's a great leader. The fact that she's navigated her country now through like 3 huge, first the mosque shooting, and then the volcano, and now the pandemic, and by all accounts, she's doing an amazing job. Listen, man, there are so many countries in Asia, in Africa, and South America that are doing an amazing job of containing this virus. Okay. Countries that I think, New Zealand's up to what, 12 deaths, countries who are still in single digits, what I mean, that have 10 times the population of New Zealand. New Zealand has 5 million people, and it's an island, man. You know what I mean? Like, that is why it's so easily contained. It's an island, and low population density. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, great, good job. You contained it and the deaths are low, and you're putting in some great policies and programs to help your people. But you know what? There's a lot of countries that are doing a great job that have way higher population density.
Yeah.
That are, I'll give Ethiopia an example. Ethiopia, 115 million people. Do you know how many deaths they have? 3.
No, how many?
3,
wow.
bro. 3
wow.
deaths and 108 cases. Okay.
Wow.
Nobody's celebrating Ethiopia, man. Nepal, the country you're from, man. 30 million people. You know how many deaths? You know how many deaths?
How many
0,
deaths?
bro.
Wow.
0. Nepal. Okay. Pakistan and India. Let's talk about the global south. Pakistan and India, with their massive populations, they're huge, the most dense countries in the world. Pakistan's number 5, India's number 2 in terms of population density. Have still deaths, that are well under 1,000. Actually, the 15 countries in the world of 183 countries that are reporting cases of COVID, there's only 15 countries in the world that report deaths of over 1,000, Ankur.
Yeah.
And all of those countries predominantly are in the West. There's only a handful of countries, Iran, Turkey, and Brazil, that report more than 1,000 deaths. Okay, so the rest of the countries are predominantly in the West. And I'll tell you why. Here's my theory on this, and nobody's talking about this, but I am. The stage 1 of the transmission is travel, right? And just how it spread so quickly in China because people were traveling for the Lunar New Year, I think it's spread quickly in the West because of the ability of people in the West to travel, right? Because they have open passports.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
They have open passports. Most of the countries in the West have open passports. They have open borders in Europe. We have the world's largest open border right here between Canada and the US, right? Our ability to travel is like no other. Those countries, these other countries that we talked about, which have very low cases of transmission, low cases of people getting sick and people dying, they don't have that same ability. The countries we got to go from, your passports, your passport won't even get you. You need a visa to go next door. Do you know what I mean? Right. So I think that, and also money, right? The social economic conditions of these countries just don't allow for people to freely travel like people in the West do. So to me, I think that is what's it about. But again, let's go back to the white savior complex. So we're celebrating this Prime Minister of New Zealand, who happens to be a white female, and the great job she's doing. Meanwhile, Bangladesh, one of the biggest populations in the world, 160 million people, 2,500 cases on core, 91 people dead. Okay, the per capita, and guess what, Ankur? The head, if we want to celebrate just amazing women, which I will never take away from that, amazing women in power, guess what, Ankur? Bangladesh's prime minister is female.
She's a woman.
You heard anything about her? You hear about the amazing job that she's doing? In 160 million people, she's keeping it down to 91 deaths. Anybody talking about her? And I'll tell you why, Ankur. Because she ain't white.
That's a fair point. I think the point you made about travel in the West, making it easier to spread to Western countries, is huge, especially in countries like Italy and Spain, where travel is so ripe to other places in the world, and where it's so easy to get to other places in Europe, right? So that's huge. In terms of the conversation about the white savior complex, I have seen that. Although I will say, I will push back a little bit on some of this. So in preparation for our conversation, I was doing a lot of reading about India, right? And the reading that I said was both good and bad. On the good note, yes, you're correct. The amount of cases are very low. The amount of deaths are very low, especially for a population of that size, right? Which is great. The bad news for India is its testing per capita is among the lowest in the world, which shouldn't be the case for a country that is one of the highest GDPs and one of the biggest economies, right? So what experts are worried about in India, there's two things that they're worried about. And I think you can really, the first one is, once testing ramps up, will they still have the same amount of cases, or are they still okay? Or is there a lot of cases that they just haven't seen yet? Right? So I think that's where the hesitation comes from. I fully agree that if these countries were Western countries and they were white leaders, we would see more attention and more praise, and we should be getting more attention and more praise. But at the same time, we do need to see more testing. The second thing I would say is, the one thing I am worried about in places like India is here in Canada, and I think we've done the one of the things that I'm very thankful for about being in Canada right now is the fact that something like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit exists, right? Is it perfect? No. But it's gotten $2,000 a month to people who need, to a lot of people who need it in less than 2 business days after applying, right? Which is huge. In India, I was reading about a lot of anxiety right now from your everyday factory workers, your rickshawales, your chaiwales, who are like, okay, how, like, I get it, Modi has told me to stay, I'll stay, but how much longer can I do this? You know what I mean? So I think right now what they're doing is phenomenal in terms of like able to keep their numbers down. But what I'm looking at to ensure that this actually stays the same is are the most vulnerable taken care of, because a lot of them right now are like, we can't keep staying here in these situations. And B, is the testing there? Because if the testing isn't there, then we could be celebrating something that actually isn't the case, right? So I'm not trying to take away from what you said, but I'm just trying to push back a little bit.
And I've heard all those arguments. So, and you know, I do buy in. Having been on the ground in a country like Pakistan and knowing what the challenges are in terms of, never mind getting testing done, doing something as simple as a census, how difficult it is in a country with that many people and geographical challenges, etc. I buy all of that. But here's a good example: China, right? People, China's underreporting its numbers. And China comes back and say, we didn't underreport, but we didn't have sufficient data because our population is so vast that we don't get the numbers as quickly as they might get them in the West. We didn't know how many people were dying at home, right? Because again, with socioeconomic challenges, people who don't go to the doctor and just try to ride it out at home, which I also think is happening in Canada and the U.S., by the way. We do have indigenous populations and other lower socioeconomic populations in the U.S. that also probably aren't being counted either, right? So I think all those numbers are going to come. So let's say that that's true. Okay, let's say like the numbers are going to come back. Okay, but this idea that the reason why India and China can clamp down is because there are these authoritarian regimes and and that there's conspiracy that they're going to underreport their numbers so people don't understand like the real, dude, like this is why I keep bringing up the fact that of the 15 countries that have over 1,000 deaths, they're by and large Western countries. Because what I want to point out is then, unless there's a massive worldwide conspiracy by the other 170 countries to underreport their numbers, it's bullshit, man. You know what I mean? And I don't think that's what it's about. And as long as we allow these conversations and this finger pointing to continue that, these countries are underreporting their numbers, and not being responsible in terms of their containment, we'll never be prepared for the next thing. Because at the end of the day, the reason why these things keep happening is also because of the way we travel, the way that we consume. Again, going back to consumerism, right? So, that's why if we want to be responsible and we want to be ready for the next one, let's stop the finger pointing and let's just figure out and learn from these countries. Because here's what I'm telling you, man. It's absolutely, the numbers are going to come up way bigger than what they're reporting now in most of these countries because, they can't get the data as fast as us. I don't think it's a massive conspiracy to
I don't
falsify the data, which is like bullshit, right? But what we can learn from a lot of these countries like Singapore, etc., is preparedness, man.
Taiwan
is learning from the time that, unlike us in the West, who maybe have like a pandemic disaster level thing happen like once in a generation. It's happening more now, but used to be like once in a generation. These countries happens every year, man. If it isn't a typhoon, if it isn't like a hurricane, if it isn't a flood, if it's not, then it's a disease, and they prepare, man. They learn from the last time. They put in policies and they put in steps to prepare for the next time, right? They learn. And we don't, A, because of the gaps, and B, because we just have that luxury of being like, you know what, we don't know when the next one's going to be and what the next one's going to be. So, we'll just, pull it out of our asses when it happens, which is what we're seeing now, right? Like to me, it's just like, are you joking? Like after this has happened, like this is the third or fourth time that a pandemic has hit North America. We're still scrambling to figure out what we should be doing. Like, you know what I mean? Like by this time you would think it'd be like in a box, you know what I mean? Like it's like a toolkit, like boom, pull out the pandemic toolkit. this is the policies that go
Yeah.
into place. Boom, boom, boom. Right? Like that's how it should
Yeah.
be.
It should be. And to be fair, Najib, I mean, Trump did fire the entire White House pandemic response team in 2018, right? Like they had a team. Like I remember Sheridan Brown tweeted out a letter, and he was like, "Hey, I wrote this letter when you fired the response team back in November of 2018, saying that if we have a pandemic, these are the people that should be in the room. You fired all of them." You know what I mean? So I mean, like I 100% agree with you. But there are certain cases, like with the US, where we can be like, here are the receipts. Like they literally did have the binder that you're talking about and the team, and he's like, "No, we don't need them." So
I know, but
and
okay,
that's
man.
just
We have to be careful when we just point fingers at the U.S. Okay, so first of all, that goes back to
yeah,
a question of
yeah,
leadership, right? Is then we should
yeah,
do better jobs picking the next leader, not pick a establishment dude who has a snowball's chance in hell of beating Trump, right?
yeah.
Well, actually, the miracle that he needed to beat Trump might have been the pandemic. So his odds of now winning have greatly increased, right? But
Increased, yeah,
leave that aside. And let's talk about our own leadership, man. Like,
yeah,
by
true.
all accounts, I think the federal government's doing a great job, but it's
Mhm.
super slow, man. Like, again, like if the preparedness was in place already, if the toolkit was in place, a lot of the things that should have already been happening, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think they're prioritizing correctly in terms of taking care of citizens first, but small businesses are suffering, man.
hmm
Still there isn't proper accommodations for nonprofits and people and frontline workers, right? There
hmm
still isn't proper accommodations and for hourly people, our so-called essential workforce, right?
hmm
All of these things, people can't go for weeks while government figures out how to implement these things, right? And
hmm
that's my
yeah.
criticism in our
I hear
government,
you.
in our governments, right? Is that, and again, we get distracted by this, here, what the US is doing and what China is doing. And this is what, these conversations go nowhere. What about this? Why don't we let them handle their shit? Why don't we handle ours, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
the
yeah.
next time we can be the ones that people admire. We can be the next New Zealand. We can be the next Singapore. We can be the ones that are held up next time. Be like, wow, man, Canada, it was like nothing to them. Like, boom, they pulled
Yeah.
out their toolkit and boom, like their citizens are taken care of.
Yeah. And no, that makes sense. I think in that case, it was just because there was like a gimme, like it was easy to point out when a country got rid of their pandemic response kit. But I do agree. I think we have especially as Canadians, and I've talked about this, I've written about this in the past. We have a negative habit of saying we're better than the States. It's all good, right? It's like a sense of like Canadian exceptionalism, where I think it should be more like, hey, we have the potential to be the best. We shouldn't strive to be better than the States. We should strive to be better than what we were before, right? And
Exactly.
improve on what we have done. And I think that's largely true. And I think we need to do better. And I think in terms of the federal government, I think you nailed it. Like, I think they've been great at expanding where they failed and listening to feedback and trying to do better. They've been great at saying, hey, this is what we said initially. We heard back that this wasn't enough, so now we're doing this. Awesome. But they have been slow. And even though it's tough for them to make these decisions, it ends up harming people on the front line. I do have a lot of sympathy right now for small businesses and small business owners who are like, I don't know how long we can last through this, right?
Yeah, man. And now the conversations I'm hearing, I saw, some video the other day, about like we gotta reset. Are you joking? The last thing we want to do is reset. Okay, reset.
So what do you mean by reset?
Reset? Like we got this is the chance that we have to like do something. Well, what do you do when you reset like a computer or you reset your phone or whatever, right? Go back to blank, and start over, right? Basically, right? And to me, it's just like, again, like this is again part of the toxic positivity, right? Like that ain't gonna happen, man. The Great Depression went on for years, right? And that's why there were some of the changes, right? I'm telling you right now, if this pandemic goes on for 3-6 months, nothing's going to change. Okay.
Yeah.
Because for people to change, things have to go on for a lot longer. So if we really do want to not reset, but what we really want to do is reinvent and reform the systems that we have in place, we have to change our behavior, and we have to start changing our behavior now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because now we have the time. Now we have, some of us, the ones who have the luxury of time, because let's not forget that the pandemic isn't affecting us all the same way. You and I being able to sit and chat for an hour and a half because we have a roof over our heads and strong internet isn't the case for everybody. And also too, by the way, you and I and others like us are going to transition back very easily, right? I just pick up my laptop and start going to my office again, right? That's not the case for an hourly worker whose business closed, right? Their restaurant closed. There's no job to go back to, and all of a sudden the $2,000 you're getting a month are gone, right? So, you know, we need to stop looking at it. And I feel like this is it. Like, I feel like because all of our influential voices, you know, on the internet are people of means, you know, or middle class or better, right? It's like this conversation of just like, oh, you know, it's no problem, you know, we're gonna reset everything, and it's gonna be like a brand new economy, and it's gonna be a brand new approach to business and how we treat each other and stuff. Like, bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, that kind of change and that kind of societal shift takes earnest effort and sacrifice, but by each and every individual.
And I think one of the things that you're hinting at here is the fact that a lot of people have treated this pandemic like it's the great equalizer. But frankly, I think it's more the great magnifying glass, and it's showing us the inequalities in our society. Whether that's looking at the data right now in the United States, where even though I was reading that even though Blacks represent 13% of the population, they now represent 30% of deaths. Like, this is a different pandemic for different people. And you're right, man. You and I have the luxury of largely being able to continue what we've been able to do because we just work on our laptops. And we don't have to go in, day out. We don't have to be exposed. And the people that are exposed because of the nature of their jobs are the most at risk. Like, I was reading something about how thousands of workers from the New York Transit Authority, I think that's the name of the company, contracted COVID. I think it was over 6,000 workers. And the majority of those workers are Blacks and Latinos, right? So what this virus is exposing is not, like, this virus isn't the great equalizer. This virus is the great magnifying glass, and it's exposing the inequalities in our society. And I think we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great analogy. You're right. I mean, it should be a magnifying glass. It should be a spotlight, you know, and absolutely, like, you know, the data is showing, because they actually collect race-related data in the US versus in Canada, they don't, which is, you know,
problematic.
It's very problematic, dude. Like, how are you supposed to recognize how to allocate resources and how to do outreach properly if you don't understand which communities are the most affected? And to your point, Blacks and Latinos, you know, 2.5 times more likely to contract it and die of COVID in the US. But you know what, Ankur? Guess what? Again, you know, like, not, you know, trying to think that the US is always the culprit here, is that when H1N1 happened in 2008, Indigenous people were 6 times more likely.
Okay? I was going to say.
6 times more likely, Ankur, okay? So, you know, so again, you know, we should be careful when we're pointing fingers and make sure that, you know, our house is in order and we're taking care of our citizens before we keep. It's very convenient for us to make the US the culprit and the bad guy because we share a border, right? But my hope is always, like you were saying, is that if we really want to be, you know, the standard in the world, and we really want to, you know, be the next time around, be the beacon where people can look towards, and the way to handle these things properly, we need to actually focus on our stuff and our weaknesses and the holes in our social systems, and not just keep pointing to the US.
Yeah, and I think that's been the flaw with our response right now. Like, I was listening to public health officials, and their argument was like, look, regardless of race, nationality, or creed, we're just trying to provide the best care to all citizens. And frankly, I think that's a flawed approach, because that approach assumes that everyone is equally affected by this virus. It doesn't take into account systemic inequities. And frankly, across various indicators, whether it's education, whether it's access to clean drinking water, whether it's overrepresentation in prisons, we know our Indigenous population is doing worse. And like you said with H1N1, they fared 6 times as worse. So it wouldn't be a surprise if they're doing worse right now. And the best thing that we could do, and the thing that we should be doing, is taking a look at how this is affecting different communities of color, how this is affecting Indigenous communities, how this is affecting immigrant communities, and understanding where it's really affecting. Like, I think both you and I have been pointing to the American stats because their stats are there, but it's just as problematic that we don't have the stats, right? Because it could be happening, we just don't know about it.
Absolutely. Okay. Any last words?
Oh, we're done. Oh, that was cool. Nah, it was just fun. It flew by. I'm sorry. I was just
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
in the middle of the conversation. I don't know if I have any last words other than this was fun. I enjoyed our conversation, and I hope for the sake of our generation, your generation, all of our generations, that these conversations that we're having right now about social justice, about political reform, about a better society lead to action. And if there's anything that I could share with folks of all generations, but especially young people, I mean, we're now more important than ever to ensure that our voices are heard and to ensure that our ideals are represented in terms of both political action, business action, and the kind of society that we want to see.
Well said, my friend. Always great talking to you.
Yeah, you as
Look
well.
forward to our next time we meet up and next time we have more conversation.
Yeah, I love that. In the meantime, please stay safe.